At 4:30, lawmakers turned to a pair of ambassadorial nominations with votes on those scheduled for an hour later at 5:30 p.m. Live coverage on C-SPAN 2 begins in just a couple of moments.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. God, our King, you are clothed in majesty and strength. Your throne has been established from the beginning, and you existed before time began. Help our lawmakers today to do their work, striving to labor for your glory. Give them the purity of life and honesty of purpose to walk in your way. Lord, strengthen their hearts and minds that they may worthily measure up to the role you have ordained for them. Thus may they fulfill their vocation to the glory of your name and the advancement of your kingdom. We pray in your sacred name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., December 12, 2011. To the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Christopher A. Coons, a senator from the state of Delaware, to perform the duties of the chair, signed Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
The Majority Leader.
Following leader remarks, the Senate will be in a period of morning business till 4:30 this afternoon. Following that morning business, Senate will be in executive session to consider nominations of Norman Eisen to be an ambassador to the Czech Republic and Maria Aponte to be ambassador to El Salvador. At 5:30, there will be at least 2 roll call votes in relation to Eisen and Aponte nominations. I ask unanimous consent that John Daly, a detailee with the Foreign Relations Committee from the State Department, be granted floor privileges for the consideration of Eisen and Aponte nominations.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today the Senate will vote on 2 nominations, those of Norman Eisen to serve as ambassador to the Czech Republic and Maria Carmen Aponte to serve as ambassador to El Salvador. These 2 individuals are in their positions as we speak, having been given recess appointments. These nominees are accomplished, qualified public servants who will continue to represent their nation with distinction. For my Republican colleagues, however, being qualified and dedicated doesn't seem anymore to be enough. Last week, they blocked the nomination of a brilliant legal mind, Caitlin Halligan, to the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, because obviously they didn't mind there are these vacancies in the court because Republicans were in the majority in that court. So defeat this competent woman, and that's what they did, with these vacancies still there in that court. And they blocked the nomination of Richard Cordray to lead the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, despite his obviously deep qualifications for the job. He has a long history of protecting the middle class against unfair practices by financial predators, and he would have been a great asset in our fight to protect Main Street from the kind of Wall Street greed that caused the 2008 financial crisis. Yet Republicans denied Mr. Cordray's nomination, I should say confirmation, and all it does is weaken the agency. Weaken the agency he was nominated to lead. I hope Republicans will not turn every confirmation process into a political three-ring circus. The candidates today, Mr. Eisen, Ms. Aponte, they've jumped through enough hoops already. Ms. Aponte's accomplished record as ambassador to El Salvador over the past 15 months speaks for itself, and experts in the region from across the political spectrum support her confirmation. The same enthusiasm is there for Ambassador Eisen. If Republicans block the confirmation of these excellent qualified candidates, it will only be for nakedly partisan reasons. Also under partisan assault this month is a Democratic proposal to prevent a $1,000 tax increase on working families. Senate Republicans have blocked 4 proposals to protect middle-class pocketbooks. Every hour they delay and every day they filibuster is one more the Senate, by necessity, will have to stay in Washington to get its work done. Republicans have opposed our plan to pay for this legislation with a tiny surtax on a tiny fraction of America's highest earners. The tax would only apply to the second or third or fourth million the wealthiest Americans make. But Republicans say the richest of the rich in our country, even those who make millions every year, shouldn't contribute more to our economy back on track. And they call our plan, time after time, a tax on job creators. And I say so-called job creators. Because I say that, Mr. President, every shred of evidence contradicts this red herring. For example, there have been many outlets, but I'll concentrate on one. National Public Radio went looking for one of these fictitious millionaire job creators. A reporter reached out to the business groups, the anti-tax lobby, and Republicans in Congress, hoping to interview one of these millionaires. Days ticked by with no luck. Millionaire job creators are like unicorns. They're impossible to find and don't exist. That's because only a tiny fraction of people making more than $1 million, probably less than 1%, are actually small business owners. And only a tiny fraction of that tiny fraction is a traditional job creator. Most of these businesses are hedge fund managers or wealthy lawyers. They don't do much hiring, and they don't need more tax breaks. One reporter looked for millionaire job creators hiding on Facebook. This time, they found a few, and they actually supported our plan. These people on Facebook actually supported our plan to ask the richest of the rich to pitch in to improve the economy for all Americans. This is what Jason Berger, owner of a contracting company, said. First of all, he's hiring like crazy. And I repeat this quote, "It's only fair that I put into the system, that is the entire reason for my success, that I put something into the system." Mr. Berger may be a millionaire, but he isn't one in a million. A majority of people who make more than $1 million a year say they would gladly contribute more to improve the economy. It's often said that what's good for business is good for America. I hope my Republican colleagues remember, as Mr. Berger said, and Mr. Berger does, that what is good for America is also good for business.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Later this week, senators will have an opportunity to do 3 big things with a single vote. By voting for the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act that will soon come over from the House, senators will be able to extend the temporary tax relief that working Americans continue to need nearly 3 years into this administration, prevent more job losses in the middle of a jobs crisis by blocking a new regulation on U.S. manufacturers, and facilitate the creation of tens of thousands of new jobs through the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. One vote, three accomplishments. And that's to say nothing of the other things the bill would do, like the dock fix and unemployment insurance. So my suggestion is that once this legislation comes over from the House, that we pass it without delay. Based on the merits of the bill, it should be a strong bipartisan vote. Nothing could be more bipartisan right now than preventing job loss or facilitating the creation of new private sector jobs. The President has said that job creation is his top priority. Here's a bill that helps him achieve it without a dime of taxpayer money. The President says he wants to extend the payroll tax extension. Here's a bill that does it. The President says he wants unemployment insurance extended. This bill does that. The President says he wants the two parties to compromise. This is it. There is no reason this legislation shouldn't have the President's enthusiastic support. The only reason for Democrats to oppose this job-creating bill would be to gain some political advantage at a time when every one of them says job creation is a top priority. Here's what the junior senator from West Virginia, a Democrat, had to say just today about the pipeline measure contained in the House bill. Quote, "I'm for the Keystone Pipeline. All the trade unions, everyone's for it. It creates thousands of jobs." I couldn't say it better. The House actually had a standalone vote on the Keystone XL back in July. 47 House Democrats voted for it. So I would suggest to my friends on the other side that they join with us and close out the year on a bipartisan note. The Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act was written to appeal to both parties, and I have yet to hear anyone on the other side offer a single good reason for opposing it. So far, the only reason Democrats have given for opposing this bill is that they'd rather extend the payroll tax cut on its own without adding language about a pipeline that many of them say they support anyway. So evidently, they'd vote for both of these things separately, but not together. That makes absolutely no sense. Look, you're either for this pipeline project and the jobs that would come with it, or you're not. And if you're for it, there's no reason to oppose it just because it's not offered as a standalone measure. That doesn't make any sense. It's time to stop the posturing. Here's a bill that contains top priorities from both sides. Let's take it up and pass it without any more theatrics. Let's pass this job-creating bill and give Americans the certainty and the jobs they deserve. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved, and under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 4:30 p.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The senator from Illinois.
I ask consent the quorum call be suspended
Without objection.
and consent to speak in morning business.
The Senate is in morning business.
Thank you, Mr. President. Last week in the Senate, the highlight of the United States Senate were two Republican filibusters. Those are efforts by the Republicans to demand 60 votes for the Senate to take action. Used to be rare. In fact, so rare that Jimmy Stewart made a movie about it, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. You may remember it. It wasn't this chamber, but it looked a lot like it. And Jimmy Stewart was back at a desk in the back row because he was a freshman senator, and he literally spoke until he dropped, physically. But he won the argument, won the day. Great triumph in Washington. He used the filibuster effectively to stop what he thought was a greedy move, a selfish move by his colleagues. That's the movies. What's real life? Real life is when a Republican senator said, I declare a filibuster and I'll see you later. I'm going out to dinner. That's how it works around here. If we had a few more Jimmy Stewart moments on the floor where those who are pushing for a filibuster, an exceptional, extraordinary 60-vote margin, had to actually stick on the floor and argue their point, I think they'd go away. Because 9 times out of 10, 19 out of 20, maybe even more, it turns out there's no solid basis for what they're doing. What they did last week with their filibusters was to stop a woman from being appointed to the district court in the District of Columbia. Her name is Caitlin Halligan. She's from New York. She's an extraordinary person who has argued many cases before the Supreme Court. I don't have her resume in front of me. I spoke to her nomination last week. She was found unanimously well qualified by the American Bar Association, and yet she was filibustered by the Republicans. And we couldn't come up with only one Republican vote to support us. Only one. All the rest said filibuster continues. To put that in historic perspective, a few years ago we had a big confrontation in the Senate before the president was elected. So I don't implicate him in any ways. But before this president, the Senate was elected, there was an argument about whether you should filibuster federal nominees. Well, a group of 14 bipartisan groups said only under extraordinary circumstances. Last week with this filibuster on this nominee, they completely forgot that, except for one, Senator Murkowski of Alaska. She remembered that promise and she kept it. She joined us in voting to break the filibuster. It wasn't enough. That nominee fell by the wayside. Wasn't enough, though. One filibuster a week isn't enough for the other side. They came up later in the week with another one. That seems to be the sum and substance of their strategy in the Senate. And this filibuster was for Richard Cordray. Richard Cordray is a former Attorney General from the state of Ohio. He is now working at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the President wants him to be the director. What is this bureau? Created by the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Bill, it will put in place for the first time in the history of the United States an agency of government focused on making certain that families and consumers know what they're signing when they get into financial transactions, and to stop those who are exploiting Americans and American families. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We have a ton of agencies that work with the financial institutions. Some of them are good, close friends of those institutions. This would be the one agency of government on the side of consumers. I know a little bit about it because I heard a speech once from Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren, a Harvard law professor, one of the most articulate spokespersons for consumer rights in America, and the watchdog on the bailout funds that Congress gave to the banks, gave a speech once and said, you know, we ought to have one agency that says to the American people, here are the tricks and traps you might find in a mortgage or a credit card agreement. And here's something we shouldn't allow under the law of America. I liked it so much I went up to her afterwards and said, I'd like to introduce the bill. She and I worked on it. We introduced it. Put the first bill in. And it gained support, popularity, to the point where when we came to the floor with the Dodd-Frank bill, Senator Chris Dodd took my idea and I will say improved it dramatically, did a great job, and included it in financial reform. My hope, the hope of many people, was that Elizabeth Warren, the person who conceived this idea, would head this agency. She was stopped cold. The banking interests and financial institutions in America said not only no, but heck no. We're not going to allow her to be the head of this agency. She worked at it, trying to get it up and running, get the right people in place, and eventually went on, and I won't pursue what her next effort will be. You can read about it anywhere in the papers. But she was the inspiration for this, and Richard Cordray was by her side as they put this agency together. The banks hate the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau like the devil hates holy water. The idea that there would actually be an independent agency looking over their transactions and their legal instruments and informing the American people when they've stepped over the line is something they find unacceptable. Let me tell you about another person working over at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Her name is Holly Petraeus. If the name rings a bell, it should. her husband, General Petraeus, has probably been in the forefront of keeping America safe since 9/11 more than any individual, serving both Republican and Democratic administrations. He has risked his life serving his country overseas. He is completely committed to our men and women in the military, and he's currently head of the CIA. His wife is cut from the same cloth. She believes in the military in her heart and soul, and she has worked at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to stop predatory lenders who are taking advantage of military families. That's the kind of work that can be done there and is being done there. But they don't have a director. They don't have a leader. So last week, we brought Richard Cordray's nomination to the floor. It's been here for a long time. No one has argued that this man is not extremely well qualified for the job. He is. The vote came up, another Republican filibuster. He fell by the wayside. Just what the banks want. They want to make certain that this Bureau does not have a leader and can't use its resources effectively. They're doing everything they can to cripple it. Well, Mr. President, if that were the end of the story, 2 bad filibusters last week, hold on to your hats, because here we come again. This week we're going to have Ambassador Marie Aponte, President Obama's choice to represent our nation as U.S. Ambassador to El Salvador before the Senate. We know Ambassador Aponte is more than qualified for this assignment because she's already performing that job with distinction. President Obama appointed her by recess appointment nearly a year ago. Let me tell you about 2 of the things she's achieved in a year as our chief diplomat in El Salvador. First, she persuaded El Salvador to send troops to assist the NATO training mission in Afghanistan in August. This is the first time any Latin American country has put troops on the ground in Afghanistan in support of American troops. This represents a significant achievement for El Salvador. 20 years ago, the people of El Salvador were struggling in the midst of a bloody civil war. Today, they are strong enough and stable enough to help others around the world in Afghanistan establish their own stable democracy. Ambassador Aponte has proven to be very effective, advocating for the U.S. interests in Latin America, a region immediately on our doorstep and with whom we have many strategic interests. Ambassador Aponte has helped to advance America's security interests in Latin America by expertly negotiating an agreement with El Salvador to open a new, jointly funded electronic monitoring center to fight transnational crime. What are we talking about here? Drug dealing and terrorism. Such gang and narcotics-related crime impact both our nation, Central America, and the world. This skilled diplomat is able to work now as a recess appointment by President Obama to ensure that El Salvador remains a strong ally in the fight against these dangers. She has already proven herself to be an accomplished diplomat in a short period of time. She has a long history of public service and experience in both the private and nonprofit sector. One of America's greatest strengths is that we're a diverse nation. Ambassador Aponte helps demonstrate that strength to the world. She is one of the few Puerto Rican ambassadors serving our nation. But despite everything that I've just said to you, her nomination has been met with unjustified resistance on the Republican side of the aisle. In 1998, Ambassador Aponte was appointed by then-President Clinton to be ambassador to the Dominican Republic. She withdrew her nomination in 1998, 13 years ago, after a Miami newspaper reported allegations that a former naturalized Cuban-American boyfriend from the early 1990s was actually a Cuban intelligence agent who was trying to recruit her. The FBI looked into the matter. They investigated it. Aponte cooperated completely, and she also severed all her ties with this individual. She was never the subject of any FBI investigation or ever accused of any wrongdoing, despite her full cooperation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Ultimately, the FBI found no evidence to support the allegations against her, none. When President Obama looked at Ambassador Aponte's record of public service, he nominated her to serve as America's ambassador to El Salvador in 2009. Once again, the critics raised the same allegations about her former relationship, even though they had been thoroughly investigated and dismissed and discredited by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Senator DeMint, South Carolina, objected to her nomination. He was the only senator objecting. So this time around, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts, along with Senator Menendez, our only Hispanic senator on the Democratic side from the state of New Jersey, made an unprecedented move. They said to Senator DeMint of South Carolina, "We will allow you to personally review the FBI files on Ambassador Aponte." So Senator DeMint appeared to raise a new objection to Aponte at that point. And listen to this one, Mr. President. This objection, new one, by Senator DeMint, stems from an editorial that the ambassador wrote in a popular El Salvadoran newspaper in June about lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Pride Month. The article was entitled, "For the Elimination of Prejudices Wherever They Exist." Her op-ed disavowed violence and hatred against individuals based on their sexual orientation, urging education and understanding. Those are hardly radical ideas. Most members of the Senate, at least, let's say, many members of the Senate, have given speeches along these lines. Well, the senator from South Carolina calls this op-ed provocative and argues it's disrespectful of El Salvador's culture and that it inflamed tensions with an important ally. There is no evidence to support what he said, none. To the contrary, El Salvador itself had already taken, before she published this editorial, steps towards more equal rights with the passage of Decree 56 in May 2010. That law prohibited all forms of discrimination by the government of El Salvador based on sexual orientation, just what the ambassador had asked for in her editorial. Decree 56 was signed 1 year before Ambassador Aponte wrote her article, 4 months before she was sworn in as ambassador. The record's there. El Salvador reaffirmed its national commitment to equality again last June when it joined the United States and more than 80 other nations in signing the Declaration for the Elimination of Violence Against Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community during the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. Let me also note that Ambassador Aponte wrote that op-ed pursuant to cables from the State Department that went out to all ambassadors around the world suggesting they write pieces or hold a similar related event. In fact, similar editorials to what Ambassador Aponte wrote were written and events were held at American embassies and posts all around the world. Why is one senator picking on this ambassador? Quite simply, the nomination of the United States ambassador to a strategically important ally like El Salvador, it's no time for a political debate that has little or nothing to do with time-honored and accepted principles in the United States and around the world. Ambassador Aponte deserves a vote in the Senate based on her work, her achievement, and her demonstrated ability to effectively advocate for the U.S. and El Salvador. She's been thoroughly vetted by the FBI and the State Department, as every nominee is. She has passed 2 separate top-secret security clearances. She has shown that she's able to work with Salvadorian leaders and achieve things way beyond what many believed could be achieved because of her skill. Mr. President, we live in challenging times. Our ambassadors are the eyes and ears of America around the world. Some of the posts they serve in are very dangerous. Look at what Ambassador Robert Ford has been doing in Syria amid that country's upheaval. Blocking qualified and talented Americans from serving in posts in El Salvador or any place in the world is not in America's best long-term interest. During our recent Foreign Relations Committee markup, which you attended, related to Ambassador Aponte's nomination, Chairman Kerry offered Senator DeMint another opportunity to review all the materials that we have regarding Ambassador Aponte. I hope he took advantage of that offer. Should he still oppose her nomination, I disagree with him, of course, but respect his rights in the Senate. He can register his vote along with the other senators. But I certainly hope that this critical and important nomination will not be unfairly held up and discredited with another filibuster. Mr. President, it's time for the Senate to move beyond filibusters to work in an effort to try to solve our problems. Mr. President, there was a recent survey of how many families in America have an immediate member of the family who is serving in the military. The number is one of the lowest in history. It turns out that families that actually know someone or have someone serving in the military are a small percentage of this great nation. My family has a nephew serving in Afghanistan with the 10th Mountain Division. Not long ago, as a college student, he worked as a doorman here in the Senate. But Michael is now serving overseas in Afghanistan. And I think about him all the time. I send him boxes of things. I don't know if he'll have any use for them or enjoy them, but it's my way of reminding him that we don't forget him. And we have a big family, and I'm sure he gets plenty of stuff. And I know that some of that must be a joy for him to receive. But more important than any material sent to him, I hope it's an expression of how we feel about him, feel about the sacrifice he's making, as so many others are making, thousands around the world, as we meet in the safety of this Senate chamber. We ask an awful lot of our men and women in uniform. We ask them to risk their lives for America. Many come back injured, some don't return, having given that promise and that pledge. They make a sacrifice which many of us have never been asked to make. And I think about that in terms of the debate that we enter into this week in the United States Senate. We're trying to turn this economy around because so many people are out of work. Businesses are struggling. The President put forward a jobs bill and for months has been pushing for its passage. We've considered a lot of parts of it. One part relating to veterans we actually agreed on. It was a breakthrough. I'm glad we did. But when it came to all the others, the millions who are out of work in America, there's still wide disagreement. We'd hoped to finish up this matter this week and head home for the holidays, where we all want to be. But unfortunately, we are embroiled in a political fight again. And the fight is over something very basic. It's this. Should we ask the wealthiest in America to pay a little more in taxes so that we can provide a payroll tax cut for almost 160 million Americans? That's it. What we hear from the other side of the aisle over and over again is no. You cannot impose a new burden on the wealthiest in America. You cannot ask any more sacrifice from people who are already earning at least $1 million a year. I thought about that, and I thought about my nephew and so many like him who sacrifice every single day for this great nation. And to think that we couldn't ask the wealthiest among us to pay a little more in taxes to help us get out of this recession and put America back to work. Those two things, unfortunately, are in sharp contrast. I think it's time for us to pass this payroll tax cut. It's desperately needed. We need to maintain our unemployment insurance because we still have too many people out of work. 4 unemployed Americans for every available job. That's a fact. Things are getting better slowly, but too slowly. And in the meantime, these people are looking every single day for a job while they do their best to keep their families together, to keep their families with the basics in life, to make sure they pay the rent, the mortgage, the utility bills. First casualty in many of these families is health insurance. Can you imagine raising children, not knowing if one trip to the emergency room will be something you could never hope to afford? Unemployment benefits allow people to keep their families together and to continue looking for work. I urge my colleagues, before we consider leaving for the holiday season, let's get the job done. President Obama has made it clear he will not allow us to go home until we get this job done. Extend the payroll tax cut for 160 million Americans. Maintain unemployment benefits for those millions who are counting on it to put bread on the table and keep their families together during a very difficult time. And let's pass a spending bill. We agreed on the limits on what we would spend. Let's pass the bill now in a bipartisan fashion. I hope that we can reach that point. One last point, Mr. President. I now hear the Republican Senate leader come to the floor and tell us that this entire debate, this entire breakdown, all the problems we've had, is about an oil pipeline. Now, I didn't know that until last week. I wish he'd have spoken up a lot earlier. That an oil pipeline, the Keystone Pipeline, which has been controversial, has to be part of any deal, he says. He said at one point that it may even create 20,000 jobs. I am quick to remind my colleague there are 14 million Americans out of work and 160 million counting on this payroll tax cut. 20,000 jobs are important. I'd love to see every job we can responsibly bring to this country. But let's not stop the business of government. Let's not stop helping this economy recover over one issue, whatever it may be, whether it's a pipeline or whatever it may be. We owe it to the people who sent us here to respect them, to show that we will do our best to keep this country moving forward and to do it in the name of so many of our men and women in uniform who are sacrificing today as we meet in the safety and security of this chamber. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senators have been offering general speeches today. Right now they're in a quorum call. We do expect to see some floor action at about 4:30 Eastern when they take up a couple of ambassador nominations to the Czech Republic and El Salvador. They'll vote on those nominations at 5:30 Eastern. The House gavels back in at 4:15 for legislative business. Members will work on pipeline safety programs and policies. And later this week, they'll focus on legislation extending the payroll tax cut and unemployment benefits, along with more federal spending for the rest of this budget year and Defense Department programs and policy. We're hearing that the House is trying to complete all their work for the year by the end of this week. President Obama today hosted the Prime Minister of Iraq for meetings as the U.S. troop drawdown continues. All American troops expected to leave that country by the end of the year. President Nouri al-Maliki also went to Arlington National Cemetery to pay tribute to those who fought in the Iraq War. He and his foreign minister also spent time with Secretary of State Clinton.
For the last few weeks, the Senate has been engaged in a familiar exercise. The Democratic majority, urged on by the President, offers up an increase in spending to be paid for by an increase in taxes. If anything, this familiar refrain should cement in the minds of the American people that President Obama and his congressional allies remain committed to a policy of tax and spend. Let's not mistake any of this for a carefully designed stimulus spending or tax policy. No, the series of tax and spend proposals brought to the Senate floor during the past few months were designed for political reasons only. It remains unclear what any of this has to do with job creation. In fact, I suspect that much of this bread and circus routine is meant to distract the attention of families and taxpayers from the President's mediocre record on job creation and economic growth. For months, the Senate has been asked to consider higher taxes, including surtaxes, on the so-called rich to pay for whatever the Democrats have settled on as their spending idea of the week. Most of those ideas were sold as stimulus, even though they include things like an infrastructure bank, which would be a brand-new GSE to gobble taxpayer resources, just like Fannie and Freddie, and which would take years just to get off the ground. Most of the ideas have been designed to appease Democrat constituencies, mostly unions, and to construct campaign season talking points attacking Republicans for their failure to increase taxes on the evil rich in order to pay for the Democrats' spending sugar highs. The focus on politics has become such a priority for the President that he is now in the unusual position of making a raid on Social Security's trust funds his principal policy objective. At first, to pay for a massive new stimulus plan of the President's, the Democrats wanted to limit deductions for people earning $200,000 or more, which in September was evidently how they defined the so-called rich. Next came a proposed surtax of 5.6% on people earning $1 million or more to pay for the President's stimulus scheme. We can't be sure, but I suspect that this jump in the income threshold for the Democrats' tax increases came when high-income Democrats in high-income jurisdictions like New York, California, and New Jersey made it clear that this is where they had to part company with the President. Next came a surtax of 0.5% on high-income earners to give funds to states to help pay mostly union workers. And then came a surtax of 0.7% on those earners to help pay for a new Fannie and Freddie called an infrastructure bank. This was followed by a surtax of 3.25% on those earners for a payroll tax expenditure. Finally came a surtax of 1.9% on those earners for the payroll tax expenditure. Mr. President, the pattern is clear. Democrats roll out their stimulus spending plan of the week, find out how much it will cost, and then find out what surtax to slap on high earners, including business income recipients. That is how we get tax proposals with rates of 5.6%, then 0.5%, then 0.7%, then 3.25%, and then 1.9%. Who knows what comes next? Never mind that businesses across this country have been clear that massive uncertainty about the current administration's policies, regulations, and tax increases is holding back their hiring, job creation, and the economy. People are uncertain about what their future health care costs will be, what their future energy costs will be, what their future regulatory environment will be, and what their future taxes will be. Given the past few months of tax rate roulette being played by the Democrats, is it any wonder that families and businesses are uncertain and pessimistic about the future? These tax rates have nothing to do with designing optimal tax policy and everything to do with scoring cheap political points and growing an already bloated federal government. These tax rates have nothing to do with engineering greater wealth or income equality through the tax code. These tax rates have nothing to do with creating a foundation for growth in jobs and the economy. They have everything to do with paying for politically favored, poll-tested stimulus spending. In the President's $800 billion plus stimulus of 2009, we were told that the measures would be temporary and we would, quote, pivot, unquote, later to fiscal austerity. But the promised pivot never comes. Still today we are told to spend more now and pivot later on, but the promised pivots never come. Unfortunately, unless we pivot, we will run off the budgetary cliff and face the deficit and debt crisis plaguing Europe today. These tax rates recently proposed by Democrats have nothing to do with long-term economic growth and more to do with the President's vision of government as the benevolent allocator of people's hard-earned income. Not content with his average deficits being close to 25% of the entire size of our economy, which we have not seen since the years surrounding World War II, the President and my Democrat friends here in the Senate want to permanently enshrine a European-sized government in the American economy. They don't just want additional infrastructure spending. They want a brand-new government bureaucracy free of Congress to tax and spend. They want an all-powerful, unchecked government czar to control the provision and costs of consumer credit cards. They want an overzealous EPA to control allowable sources of energy, no matter what the costs of their policies. And they want an activist Labor Department to control how workers and companies can bargain, to control where you can operate a business, and to push people into their union voting base, whether they support the union or not. The President's pursuits are not those of someone who thinks that in certain instances government is constitutionally authorized to act and can occasionally do some good. His record is that of someone who is confident that in most cases government technocrats can do better things with Americans' hard-earned incomes than Americans can do for themselves. Mr. President, when you look at the variable menu of recent tax rates proposed by Democrats, you have to ask whether, once enshrined into law, the 5.6% rate or the 0.5% rate or whatever happens to be their flavor of the week is where my friends on the other side of the aisle would leave things. I have every reason to doubt that they would stop at those rates and every reason to believe that they will work as hard as they can to keep increasing those rates, demolishing businesses and jobs as they go. I have every reason to believe that the current President will stick with his commitment to, quote, spread the wealth around, unquote, and ask the so-called rich, who can be people who earn as little as $200,000, according to Democrats, to pay, quote, just a little bit more, unquote. So where will they stop? What is the optimal tax-the-rich rate of taxation? Economist Peter Diamond, who was nominated by the President to serve on the Federal Reserve Board, has proposed in recent writings that, quote, tax policy needs to be socially acceptable, unquote, and then finds it acceptable to go on to say that the so-called optimal top tax rate, or rate of tax, could be as high as 73%. The current top marginal tax rate on earnings in the U.S. economy is around 42.5% when you combine income tax rates of 35% with the Medicare tax and average state taxes. And the cutoff for the top percentile of tax filers is about $400,000, according to Diamond's analysis. When you consider the liberal conventional wisdom about how businesses operate, the American people, it seems to me, should be fearful about where the Democrats' tax hike proposals might lead. The bottom line is that the sky's the limit. Consider the New York Times December 9th editorial tucked in between advertisements for jewelry, properties, and baubles that only the truly mega-rich could afford, where the liberal press offered the following guidance on tax policy, quote, the latest Democrat bill to cut the payroll tax blocked by Republicans on Thursday called for a 1.9% surtax on income over $1 million. More important for any savvy business owner, a surtax would have no bearing on hiring decisions. If new workers are profitable before tax, they will be profitable after tax, even if the employer has to pay slightly more of the profit in taxes, unquote. This perfectly encapsulates the understanding of the economy by folks who have never run a business or tried to turn a profit. The liberal notion is that business owners are immune to basic economics and their hiring decisions are entirely unaffected by tax rates.
Excuse me, the senator's time has expired.